At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
It's 1947. India is finally free from the British rule, but the next challenge had already begun. India was called poor. Its population was rapidly growing, agricultural productivity was low, and feeding hundreds of millions of people was an enormous challenge. For decades, many foreign observers questioned whether India would ever be able to produce enough food for its growing population. Cut to 2026. India is now one of the largest economies in the world's most populous country, and one of the fastest growing major economies in the world. And guess what? India is also the world's largest exporter of rice and the world's largest producer of milk. A country that once depended on foreign grain shipments now produces enough staple food for its enormous domestic market while also supplying agricultural products for countries around the world. So, how did this happen? Welcome to the first episode of our limited series, The India Advantage, where we break down six of India's biggest economic strengths. And the first one is food. It's 1947. India had a population of roughly 340 million. Agriculture depended heavily on the monsoon, farm productivity was low, irrigation was limited, and food shortages were very common. India had just emerged from colonial rule with a devastating memory of Bengal famine still fresh. And there was one problem that made everything worse. India was growing faster than its ability to produce food. Some foreign observers were deeply pessimistic about India's future. In 1967, American brothers William and Paul Paddock published Famine 1975, arguing that population growth and inadequate food production could push several developing countries towards catastrophic famine. India was among the countries they considered particularly vulnerable. And at that time, that concern wasn't entirely theoretical. During the 1950s and 60s, India relied heavily on imported food grains. Through America's PL 480 Food for Peace program, large quantities of wheat were shipped to India. Food aid became an important part of India's food security system and also a source of geopolitical leverage for Washington. Then came one of India's worst agricultural crises. In 1965 and 66, severe droughts hit the country. Food production fell, imports increased, and the government faced enormous pressure to feed millions of Indians. India needed a solution, and that solution became the Green Revolution. The basic idea was very simple: produce dramatically more food from the same amount of land. India introduced high yielding varieties of wheat and rice, expanded irrigation, increased the use of fertilizers and pesticides, mechanized farming, and strengthened agricultural research. American scientist Norman Borlaug's high yielding wheat varieties played an important role. But India's transformation was not simply imported from abroad. Indian scientists, policymakers, and farmers adapted these technologies into India's own conditions. And the results were extraordinary. In 1950-51, India produced about 51 million tons of food grains. By 2014-15, that figure had risen to roughly 253 million tons. And according to the Indian government's final estimates, food grain production reached about 332 million tons in 2023-24. In other words, India's population more than tripled after independence, but its food grain production increased more than sixfold from 1950 level. But India needed more than just wheat and rice. It also needed milk. And that led to another revolution. In the 1970s, India launched Operation Flood, led by the National Dairy Development Board. The program connected millions of small daily farmers to organized markets and cooperatives, transforming milk production and distribution. And the result? Well, India went from a country that struggled with milk shortages to becoming the world's largest producer of milk, accounting for roughly 24% of global milk production. But producing food is only half the battle. A country also need to make sure that the food reaches its people. And that's where India's food security infrastructure came in. The government expanded procurement, storage, and distribution through institutions such as the Food Corporation of India. Farmers could sell grain to the government at procurement prices, while the government built buffer stocks and supplied subsidized food through the public distribution system. This created something India had desperately lacked in the 1960s, a food security cushion. And this is where the India story completely changed. The country went from depending on foreign grain shipments to becoming largely self sufficient in its major staple cereals. But India did not stop at feeding itself. It became a major agricultural exporter. Today, Indian rice, spices, seafood, sugar, coffee, and several other agricultural products are sold across global markets. India is particularly dominant in rice. It has the world's largest rice exporting countries title since 2012. And in recent years, that accounted for roughly a third of global rice exports. In FY25, India exported around 20.2 million tons of rice worth about $12.5 billion. dollars. And the destinations are global. India's non basmati rice goes extensively to markets in Africa and Asia, while premium basmati rice is exported to countries including Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, and the United Kingdom. Seafood is another major export story. India's seafood exports reached a record $8.46 billion in FY26, with frozen shrimp accounting for the overwhelming majority of export earnings. The United States and China are among India's biggest markets. So, India's agricultural story is no longer simply about survival. It has become a story about global trade. But then there is an important catch too. The Green Revolution solved one enormous problem, but it also created new ones. The model that transformed Punjab and Haryana relied heavily on irrigation, fertilizers, and water intensive crops. Over time, groundwater depletion, soil degradation, and environmental pressure have become serious concerns. India also remains dependent on imports for some agricultural commodities, particularly edible oils and pulses. And then there is the biggest challenge of all, climate change. More unpredictable monsoons, extreme heat, floods, and droughts are directly affecting crop yields. So, the question now India is facing is very different from the question it faced in the 1960s. Back then, the question was, can India feed itself? Today, it is, can India feed 1.4 billion people sustainably? And this is where India's next agricultural revolution is already beginning. The first green revolution was about putting more inputs into farming, more irrigation, fertilizer, improved seeds, and machinery. The next one could be about using technology to make every input more efficient. Satellite imagery can monitor crops, drones can survey fields and apply inputs more precisely. Artificial intelligence can help identify crop diseases and predict weather risks. Digital platforms can connect farmers to markets and potentially reduce information gaps. India's digital agriculture initiatives are attempting to build better systems around farmers, lands, crops, and agricultural markets. Imagine a farmer getting an early warning that extreme weather could damage a crop. Imagine satellite data telling a farmer exactly which part of a field needs water. Imagine AI helping determine when to sow and when to irrigate and when to harvest. That could allow India to produce more food while using less water, less land, and fewer resources. So, from roughly 50 million tons of food grains in 1950 to more than 320 million tons now. From dependence on imported American wheat to becoming the world's largest rice exporter. From milk shortages to becoming the world's largest milk producer, and from a country worried about feeding itself to one of whose agricultural products are now reaching markets across globe. That is one of independent India's biggest economic transformations. But the story isn't over, because feeding 1.4 billion people isn't just about producing enough calories. It is about producing nutritious food, keeping it affordable, protecting farmers, conserving water, and surviving a changing climate. The first agricultural revolution helped India survive. The next one has to help India thrive. And that is the real story of Indian agriculture over the last 79 years. Not simply how India learned to feed itself, but how a country once worried about famine became one of the world's most important food producers.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.